live from Baku, Azerbaijan. You're watching A News. I'm Katie Wilson. Let's take a look at today's top stories. A suicide bombing kills dozens at a Shiite mosque during Friday prayers in Islamabad. Diplomatic efforts between Washington and Tehran return to focus as indirect talks begin in Oman. And athletes in Cortina d'Ampezzo project confidence ahead of the Winter Olympics opening ceremony. Thanks for joining us. At least 31 people were killed and more than 160 others injured after an explosion struck a Shiite mosque during Friday prayers in Islamabad. No group has claimed responsibility for the blast as yet. Our correspondent Hira Mustafa sent us this report from the site of the explosion.
The blast occurred during Friday prayers in the outskirts of Islamabad. Hundreds had gathered at a Shia mosque down this road when eyewitnesses say a deafening explosion occurred. Residents of the locality have described scenes of panic and chaos in the aftermath of the blast as locals try to take those injured to nearby hospitals. Forensic teams are on site collecting evidence to aid the investigation. Police, rangers and army personnel have also been deployed and the area has been cordoned off. Hospitals across the capital remain on high alert and officials have said they fear the death toll could rise further. The Prime Minister and Foreign Minister have condemned the attack. Pakistan's President Asif Ali Zardari has said targeting innocent civilians is a crime against humanity and that the nation stands with those impacted. This blast comes less than 3 months after a suicide bomb blast struck a judicial complex in Islamabad, killing at least 12 people and injuring dozens. Authorities say investigations are ongoing and security has been tightened across the city. Hira Mustafa for A News in Islamabad.
Efforts to cool tensions between Washington and Tehran are back in focus as indirect negotiations get underway in Oman. With military pressure still high and the scope of talks contested, uncertainty surrounds whether diplomacy can prevent a wider confrontation. On the streets of Tehran, ordinary Iranians are voicing fears over the cost of escalation in hopes that dialogue can still avert war.
Iran and the United States are edging back toward diplomacy, holding high-stakes talks in Oman on Friday, aimed at easing tensions over Tehran's nuclear program after weeks of military brinkmanship. The discussions, mediated by Oman, come amid a US military build-up in the region and warnings from both sides that failure could trigger a wider Middle East conflict. While Washington says it wants negotiations to also address Iran's missile program, regional activities and human rights, Tehran has insisted talks focus strictly on the nuclear file. An Iranian official told Reuters the negotiations had not formally begun, but that Iran's demands had already been passed to the US through Omani intermediaries. Indirect talks are expected to follow shuttle diplomacy, a format used in previous rounds. As diplomats work behind closed doors in Muscat, residents in Tehran say the stakes are painfully real.
If war breaks out, our currency will weaken further against the dollar. For ordinary people, life will only get harder. That's why we oppose war. A successful negotiation would be the best outcome. War serves no one's interest.
Despite heightened rhetoric, some Iranians remain cautiously hopeful that diplomacy will prevail.
The U.S. has moved its forces into the region, but I think the actual chance of war is only about 1%. I'm sure an agreement will be reached. They cannot afford a confrontation with Iran. They would face serious consequences, too.
Others warn that Iran is already suffering the consequences of confrontation through sanctions and inflation.
Fundamentally, war yields no good results. We are already at war, an economic war. The inflation we're suffering now is worse than a military conflict. I hope our decision makers and diplomats can find a path to prevent military war. Our country's territorial integrity is paramount. They must do everything possible to avert a military war.
Tensions spiked earlier this week after the US military said it shot down an Iranian drone near the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln in the Arabian Sea. Iran has warned that any attack would prompt retaliation against US and allied interests in the region. Iran and the United States previously held 5 rounds of indirect talks under Omani mediation starting last April, but those efforts collapsed after Israeli strikes on Iranian targets and subsequent US attacks on nuclear facilities. With both sides warning of catastrophic consequences if diplomacy fails, residents here say they are watching the talks closely, hoping negotiators choose dialogue over escalation.
Well, ahead of those nuclear talks with the US in Oman, Iran's Revolutionary Guards entered into service its advanced ballistic missile. It's a newly unveiled underground base. Our correspondent reports from Tehran.
Iran's Islamic Revolution Guard Corps, IRGC, has deployed the long-range ballistic missile Khorramshahr 4 at an underground site, which was unveiled on Wednesday, according to a report by Fars news agency. The agency, which is close to the Revolutionary Guards, said in a report on Thursday that the medium to long-range ballistic missile, also dubbed Khaybar, has come into service and will be operated by IRGC's aerospace force. It is reportedly equipped with one of the largest warheads developed in Iran, carrying a payload of 1.5 tons of high explosives and capable of pounding targets at an estimated range of 2,000 kilometers. At the final days of the Israel-US 12-day war last June, Iran fired this projectile at Israel in retaliation for US strikes on 3 major Iranian nuclear facilities. Tehran's ballistic missile capability, which proved a game changer during the war, has been one of the points of contention, with Washington demanding lowering their range. Unveiling of the new underground facility, which are called missile towns, came on eve of renewed nuclear negotiations between Iran and US in Muscat on Friday, mediated by the Sultanate of Oman. Turaj Shiralilu, Tehran, Foreign News.
The US and Russia have agreed to re-establish high-level dialogue between their armed forces. The announcement comes after a meeting of senior US and Russian military officers in Abu Dhabi. President Trump repeatedly voiced his call to normalize relations between the two countries.
The United States and Russia have agreed to resume regular military-to-military contact, re-establishing a channel that had been suspended since 2021. The agreement was reached during a meeting of senior US and Russian military officers in Abu Dhabi this week, held on the margins of discussions related to the war in Ukraine. In a statement, US-European Command said the renewed dialogue would provide consistent communication between the two armed forces to reduce the risk of miscalculation and unintended escalation. Military contacts between Washington and Moscow were stopped shortly before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since then, incidents involving aircraft and drones have been reported near NATO airspace, as well as over the Black Sea and Syria. The announcement comes a day after the New START treaty expired on the 5th of February, ending the last legally binding limits on US and Russian strategic nuclear weapons. US President Donald Trump has said the United States should work toward a new arms control framework, while Russia has said it remains open to dialogue. Officials said the restored channel would allow regular communication between senior commanders.
A senior Russian military intelligence official has been shot and wounded in Moscow. Lieutenant General Vladimir Alexeyev was immediately taken to hospital after the attack at an apartment building in the northwest of the capital. Russian investigators have not named suspects. The shooting comes amid a series of assassinations of senior Russian officers since the war in Ukraine began, attacks Moscow has blamed on Kyiv. Over to the US now, and the US military said it killed 2 people in a strike on a suspected drug vessel in the Eastern Pacific on Thursday. In a statement, they said the vessel was engaged in narco-trafficking operations, adding that no US military forces were harmed. The United Nations Human Rights Chief has previously condemned the US actions, calling the offshore strikes against alleged drug dealers unacceptable and a violation of international human rights law. The Trump administration has framed the attacks as a war with drug cartels, alleging they were armed groups. Whiteout conditions continued to grip northern Japan on Friday, prompting authorities to urge residents to avoid non-essential travel. Severe winter weather is forecast to persist as heavy snowfall disrupts transport and daily life. Since snow intensified in late January, at least 35 people have died, mostly due to landslides and snow-related incidents. Officials also reported over 350 injuries nationwide, ranging from minor to serious cases. Well, staying in Japan, President Trump has publicly endorsed Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi just days before voters head to the polling stations this Sunday. The snap general election was called by Takaichi as she seeks a stronger mandate in the middle of cost of living concerns.
US President Donald Trump has publicly endorsed Japan's Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi in a post on his social media platform, Truth Social, just days before the election. Trump described Takaichi as a strong leader and said it was his honor to give her a complete and total endorsement. He added that he'll see her in Washington on the 19th of March. Foreign endorsements are rare in Japanese elections, making Trump's intervention unusual. It highlights the importance of the US-Japan alliance, even as most voters say domestic issues matter more than foreign policy. It comes as voters head to the polls this Sunday for a general election after Takaichi called a snap vote seeking a stronger mandate for her government. The campaign has focused on the cost of living, taxes and economic stability as voters decide whether to keep the ruling coalition in power, but some say they are frustrated with rising prices and tax burdens under the current government.
I'm not satisfied with things. Taxes are deducted too much, and it feels like it's putting real pressure on people's lives.
Others argue Japan needs stable leadership, especially at a time of regional and global uncertainty.
I do support Prime Minister Takaichi. I think stability is important, and she should have more time to lead the country.
The main opposition is the Centrist Reform Alliance, led by former Prime Minister Yoshihiko Noda. They're also campaigning on cutting taxes and addressing the cost of living, but opinion polls suggest it trails Takaichi's ruling coalition.
Indonesia and Australia signed a new security treaty in Jakarta on Friday, committing both sides to consult each other if either faces a threat. The agreement was confirmed after talks between Indonesia's President and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, though full details have not yet been released. The pact reflects closer ties while Indonesia maintains its long-standing non-aligned foreign policy. Albanese said the treaty marks the strongest point in bilateral relations, drawing on a security framework first established in 1995. Now, anticipation is building across Italy as preparations for the Winter Olympics opening ceremony reach their final stages. Athletes are in place, venues are ready, and attention is focused on a multi-location celebration set to launch the Games.
Athletes competing in Cortina d'Ampezzo have voiced a mix of excitement and determination as they prepare for the Olympic opening ceremony and the start of competition. For some, the Games mark their Olympic debut, but many say their focus is firmly on medal ambitions rather than ceremony nerves.
Yeah, we had a good season so far, and we also like the track, so we are going all in and we try to get a medal.
I'm super excited actually. I'm going to be flag bearer, so it's incredible, and I'm super proud to be out here representing Malaysia. So yeah, it's going to be incredible. I'm super excited.
Beautiful scenery, and yeah, the environment's been pretty good. Everyone's so friendly, meeting lots of new people. And then, yeah, the track's looking in good condition, so we're excited to get on ice soon.
Yeah.
The Italian mountain resort will host several key Olympic events, including women's alpine skiing and the sliding disciplines of bobsleigh, skeleton and luge. While the main opening ceremony will take place at Milan's San Siro Stadium, Cortina and other northern mountain venues such as Livigno will stage their own parade of nations, complete with additional flag bearers.
Turisti stanno ancora arrivando.
The tourists are still arriving because these past few days were mostly training sessions. The athletes were testing the courses, slopestyle, ski cross, and starting today the tourists will really begin to arrive, so it's going to be a huge celebration.
Italian authorities have stepped up security around San Siro, where the primary ceremony will unfold. The innovative format, connecting co-host Cortina more than 400 kilometers away, is expected to draw a vast global audience. The opening ceremony revolves around the concept of harmony, a theme chosen to convey a universal message of peace, unity, and dialogue. Around 1,200 volunteer performers will take part in the grand opening ceremony, with some 1,400 different costumes set to be showcased throughout the event. Anticipation is particularly high for performances by US pop star Mariah Carey and Italian tenor Andrea Bocelli, who are expected to headline the ceremony.
After the break, we'll assess the opening round of US-Iran talks in Oman and what negotiators may or may not be willing to accept. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. Senior US and Iranian officials have held talks in Oman amid a crisis that has raised fears of a military confrontation between the two countries. Joining us now to discuss this is Professor Ivani Vasole from State University in New York. Thank you for joining us. Now, what do we know so far about what was discussed during these talks?
Thank you for having me. So the talks are just beginning. So it is still, to some extent, unclear how the negotiations are going on. Although we have already some statements from Oman, in which some observers are noting that the negotiations started, that they are serious, and that there is the expectation of progress. Yet, as we can discuss further, we know that the relationship between United States and Iran is very conflicted, complex for many years, indeed for more than 4 decades, since the beginning of the Islamic Revolution that it created the Islamic Republic of Iran. Since then, 1979, there have been numerous problems in the relationship, and there is a long way to go.
Now, we have had comments from Iran's foreign minister. He was speaking on state television and he described the meeting as a good beginning. What do you make of that comment from the foreign minister?
Well, it is a good beginning because at least there is an willingness. So both sides, United States government and Iranian government, are willing to talk about. The problem is the disagreements that they have about what will be included in these negotiations. Iran already clearly stated that you'd like to discuss only the nuclear issue. Yet the United States wants to include other topics, for example, the Iranian ballistic missile program. And also the government of the United States wanted to discuss the support of the government of Iran to groups, armed movements in the region, such as Hamas and Hezbollah. And these issues of discussing ballistic missiles and the relationship of the Iranian government with Hamas, for example, is something that Iranians don't want to bring to the table. So this disagreement could potentially create problems for progress in this round of negotiations in Oman.
And now, in recent weeks, Trump has actually threatened to bomb Iran if they don't reach a deal, and Iran has vowed to respond to that attack with force, and they've threatened to strike American military assets in the Middle East and Israel. So that's potentially what's at stake here if there isn't a deal reached. How concerned are you about those threats? Do you think they are something that could genuinely escalate?
Yes, we are concerned in the United States about the problems that could arise from a lack of agreement. You are absolutely right. The past few days, President Trump, in an interview to an American TV channel, said that, things can go very bad if we don't have an agreement. So it's, it's a type of threat to Iran presented by the President of the United States. And as we know, the military presence of US near Iran is huge now, with 2 aircraft carriers. So there is a great deal of tension in the region. But also we cannot forget that Iran does have retaliatory capability. So Iran can respond in case of an attack, and can even respond by creating problems in the Hormuz Strait, where we have this huge traffic of oil there, shipments of oil, and this could create a lot of problem for the world economy, including for United States. It seems that at this point, based on what we can hear from the US administration, that the possibility of sending American soldiers to invade Iran is something discarded. The US administration is not thinking about that. But there is always the possibility of an attack, and we have to consider that on June 22nd, past year, 2025, the United States attacked Iran against the Iranian nuclear capabilities, and this could be a possibility again.
And talk us through a bit more about the Iranian government and where that sits. Analysts have said the government is in its weakest position since it came to power following the 1979 Islamic Revolution. And of course, this is off the back of those nationwide anti-government protests across the country. So what position is the Iranian government currently in as it goes into these talks?
On one hand, again, the retaliatory capabilities of the Iranian government is something to be considered. This could disrupt the world. So this is a positive side for Iran. On the other hand, we know that Iran is in a weaker position because of the loss of an ally in the region, that the former president of Syria, Bashar Assad, fled Syria, and obviously by doing this, the relationship between Syria and Iran is not what it used to be. In addition, as a result of the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, Iran also lost some strength because of the actions of Israel, military action against Hamas, but also against the Hezbollah. So these 2 allies of Iran in the region are, they also lost strength. So the situation for Iran is complex, without mentioning the fact of the domestic situation in Iran. We had protests in December. Thousands of people died in the Iranian cities because of the protests. So there is a problem for Iran in this regard, a political problem. This is the situation, and now what Iran is asking, essentially, is that Iran is willing to negotiate with the US. Iran said that, we have some flexibility in relation to the negotiations. Iran is asking US to reduce and possibly to eliminate the sanctions that United States imposes on Iran for several years now. United States, based on the statements made by the Secretary of State, that is Mr. Mark Rubio, know that United States wanted to discuss many issues.
So given all of these factors at play, and given that these analysts are saying Iran's government is in the weakest position since it came to power following the Islamic Revolution in 1979, does that explain why Iran is coming to the table indirectly now? And what does this mean for regional stability?
So indirectly, it's because of this is preliminary. So what we know is that there are two U.S. envoys in Oman. Witkoff, that is a very close advisor to President Trump, and the Jared Kushner, that is the president's son-in-law. And also, it's very incipient talks. There is uncertainty at this point where these talks are going to end. What is the end game of these talks? For regional stability, the question is how the United States is going to respond in case of a failure of these negotiations. In case that there is no agreement, and there is also, we cannot forget, another very important critical actor in the region, that is Israel. So, no, the region is not stable at this point.
Thank you very much for joining us on the programme, for providing your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Now, after the break, we'll take a look at the major stories from the region. Welcome back to A News. Now, let's take a closer look at the key stories shaping the region. Syria's foreign minister held talks in Damascus on Thursday with visiting French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot. The talks focused on bilateral relations, political and economic cooperation, and reaffirmed Syria's unity and territorial integrity. Barrot also welcomed a recent agreement between Syria's authorities and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, saying it supports Kurdish rights and efforts against Islamic State. Central Asia is moving into focus in Washington as the United States looks for new partners in the supply of critical minerals. At the first ministerial conference on critical minerals, countries of the region presented concrete proposals aimed at strengthening their role in global supply chains. Our correspondent Fariza Kalamurzana reports.
Central Asia has emerged as a potential supplier of critical minerals to the United States following the first ministerial conference on strategic minerals held in Washington. The meeting delivered several concrete outcomes. Kazakhstan said it's ready to supply the US with 20 of the 60 critical minerals identified by the US Geological Survey. Uzbekistan, meanwhile, signed a memorandum with Washington covering cooperation in the extraction and processing of critical minerals and rare earth materials. The announcements come as the United States looks to diversify supply chains for strategically important resources and reduce reliance on a limited number of dominant suppliers. Within the region, Kazakhstan is moving fastest to formalize its role in this process. The country has designated rare and rare earth metals as a strategic sector, with a government development plan in place through 2028. Officials say Kazakhstan has sufficient reserves, processing capacity, and infrastructure to expand supplies for external markets. Uzbekistan is also accelerating work in this sector. President Shavkat Mirziyoyev has announced plans to invest $500 million in rare earth deposits. And according to experts, Central Asia hosts nearly 170 known occurrences of rare earth elements, ranging from proven deposits to early stage prospects. And if developed, these reserves could provide an alternative to China's dominant position in the global market. The next challenge is how these resources reach global markets. Analysts point to the Trans-Caspian transport route, known as the Middle Corridor, as the primary route for exporting the region's mineral resources to international markets. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A-News.
Uzbekistan is moving closer to launching Islamic banking after the Senate approved legislation aimed at expanding financial inclusion and attracting billions of dollars in new investment. Seva Rajapova reports from Uzbekistan.
Uzbekistan is preparing to introduce Islamic banking following Senate approval of a law establishing legal tax and licensing rules for Sharia-compliant financial services. The reform allows banks to operate fully under Islamic principles or open so-called Islamic windows alongside traditional products. The legislation draws on the experience of Malaysia, Turkey and the United Arab Emirates and introduces financial models such as Murabaha, Mudarabah and Musharaka. Authorities say the sector could unlock up to $5 billion in annual financing potential, according to earlier government assessment. The central bank will oversee a new Islamic Finance Council, while a separate tax regime, including VAT exemptions, aims to make these products more competitive. Officials say the change responds to strong domestic demand. A UNDP survey found 68% of citizens and 60% of businesses prefer financial services aligned with religious principles. Experts expect the first Islamic banking products to appear within 6 to 12 months, once regulatory procedures are completed. Authorities believe the reform will attract foreign investment from Islamic finance markets, while mobilizing domestic capital and support long-term growth of Uzbekistan financial sector. It is Sivil Rajab reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A-News.
President of Azerbaijan Ilham Aliyev received a delegation from Iran led by Defense Minister Aziz Nazirzadeh. According to official statements, the sides discussed bilateral relations, regional security developments and prospects for defense cooperation. The meeting followed recent high-level contacts between Baku and Tehran, including a phone call between President Aliyev and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. High-level talks in Ankara brought Turkey and the European Union back to the table to discuss the future direction of their long-standing relationship. Turkish officials said the focus was on fair enlargement, renewed momentum on EU accession and the progress on modernising the customs union. Our correspondent Adam Morrow has more.
On Friday, EU Enlargement Commissioner Marta Kos, along with an accompanying delegation, arrived in Turkey for a two-day visit for talks with senior Turkish officials. Upon her arrival in Ankara, where she was welcomed by Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, Kos and her delegation met with Vice President Cevdet Yilmaz, as well as Turkey's Trade Minister and Deputy Foreign Minister. After the meeting, Yilmaz said the talks had focused on the strategic nature of Turkey-EU relations, the importance of a fair EU enlargement policy, and the need for tangible progress in bilateral ties. He said concrete steps on Turkey's EU accession process and the modernization of the EU-Turkey customs union were of vital importance for relations between the two sides, adding that ties should not be confined to what he described as narrow issues. The Turkey-EU customs union, which entered into force in 1995, is currently limited to industrial goods and processed agricultural products. Ankara has repeatedly called for the resumption of talks to update the customs union, but concrete steps have yet to be taken. Turkey was first granted EU candidate status in 1999. However, accession talks have stalled in recent years over concerns related to human rights and alleged democratic backsliding. Last November, Ankara criticized a European Commission report on Turkey, describing it as biased and rejecting claims about the country's human rights record. After Friday's meetings in Ankara, Vice President Yilmaz said Turkey-EU cooperation should be based on equality, merit, and inclusiveness, as well as mutual interest and shared responsibility. This is Adam Mara for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
A call for public debate on Georgia's European Union integration is stirring renewed discussion in the political space. The initiative comes from United Neutral Georgia, a party formerly outside the ruling coalition, who is questioning whether EU integration serves Georgia's national interests. The proposal has prompted a response from Prime Minister Irakli Hobakidze, who says any discussion is possible, but the constitutional framework remains unchanged.
A call for public debates on Georgia's European Union integration has triggered controversy, not only over its content, but over how freedom of speech and public opinion are being interpreted in the political process. The initiative was put forward by United Neutral Georgia, which called on television broadcasters to organize debates questioning whether the EU integration still serves Georgia's national interests. In its statement, the party claims that society has grown skeptical of the European path and argues that the issue should be openly reconsidered. Prime Minister Irakli Hobakidze responded by welcoming the idea of debates, stating that discussion on any topic is acceptable and framing the initiative as an expression of freedom of speech. At the same time, he emphasized that Georgia's constitution defines EU membership as the strategic goal. The government's openness to debate comes amid a contrasting recent record. Over the past 2 years, pro-European demonstrations, civil society campaigns, and critical media voices have frequently been dismissed by ruling party representatives as destabilizing, foreign influenced, or politically motivated. European institutions have repeatedly raised concerns over restrictions on media freedom, pressure on NGOs, and narrowing space for dissent. Recent public opinion surveys consistently showed that around 70% of Georgian citizens support the EU integration, suggesting a significant gap between the party's claims and measured public statement. Nini Nikolaishvili, Tbilisi, A News.
After the break, we'll examine the meeting which took place today between the European Commissioner for Enlargement and Turkey's Foreign Minister. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. The European Commissioner for Enlargement, Marta Kos, met with Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan in Ankara today, where they agreed to continue work towards modernising the EU-Turkey customs union. Well, joining us now to tell us more is political analyst Klaus Jürgens. Thank you for being with us. Now, why is the EU interested in making this visit?
Well, thanks for having me. Now, I could write books about this. I did actually write quite a few extended stories. Now, I will be very brief. As you know, the Turkey-EU accession talks, I would call it a saga, is decades old and decades long. And every time I see something positive coming out of renewed meetings, I actually say, wow, has Brussels finally woken up? And I'm very outspoken about this. Turkey did whatever it could, whatever it should, to facilitate a speedy EU accession. And this goes back actually almost 15 years, perhaps even almost 2 decades. And the only obstacle at the time was that a number of issues, of course, were complicated. Think about environmental protection, think about public procurement, but Turkey always said straight away, we can do this, give us 2 years. It was not Turkey not wanting to be part of the European Union, it was the EU always putting a number of roadblocks in it. Now, back to today and tomorrow, Marta Kos, a very important visit by the EU Enlargement Commissioner. And what really makes me optimistic this time is it is not only about visa liberalization, which has to be agreed, please, as quickly as possible. It is not only about giving a perspective when Turkey actually can become a full member state, but the EU itself has realized, and as you asked in your question, sorry for my long reply, there is a new geopolitical order, there's a new world order, there's a new Donald Trump Board of Peace order. And the EU, I think, has realized that without Turkey being on board, nothing of our very, very important goals can ever be achieved. Peace and stability in a wider region. And that includes Syria and Iraq, that goes all the way to the Southern Caucasus and all the way to the Balkans and Southeastern Europe. And I'm not even mentioning Ukraine and Turkey as a key mediator between Russia and Brussels, when no one else wanted to talk with Russia anymore. So yes, your question, indeed, the EU, I think, is recognizing and realizing Turkey's much more important and relevant role, not only in the region, but almost in the wider European context. So yes, I am slightly more optimistic than I usually am.
So you've talked about multiple factors reshaping the world order, such as a Trump presidency, but tell us more about the war in Ukraine. To what extent is that driving this effort for dialogue between the EU and Turkey?
Well, Brussels has realized that there are two options. You can send money to President Zelensky, you can send money to Ukraine, you can pretend everything is fine as long as this is done and that Russia one day will give in. A former German chancellor once very famously said, there will never be a world without Russia. And I think this, although for some it might be a very sobering realization, means that yes, Moscow will be there, Russia will be there, and in order to create lasting peace in Ukraine and Russia, we have to talk with both sides. Now, who can do this? By only unilaterally supporting one side, Moscow will not accept it. By only unilaterally supporting the other side, the Ukraine will not accept it. So it has to be a give and take. And with my insight, modest insight, if I may say so, President Zelensky must come to his own acceptance that there will be discussions about a certain territorial give and take. Russia must feel safe, Ukraine must feel safe, and then NATO enlargement and all the other issues can be sidelined for some time. But take a look, my dear colleague, at the NATO expansion chart over the past decade. Of course, if you would sit now in the Kremlin in Moscow and you would see that NATO is expanding eastwards, of course, would you not by logic at some point say, what can we do to make sure that our territory stays integral and integrated? Now, Ukraine, of course, the Ukrainian people want peace.
And what's Turkey's role in this? Obviously, you mentioned Turkey is potentially a mediator here. Could you talk us more about how Turkey has a key role to potentially play in this?
Yes, very briefly. I think it goes back to what Said Ibrahim Kalin coined the term quite some years ago. He says Turkey has a 360 degrees foreign policy by now. You look north, east, south, west. And Turkey, once the Ukraine conflict really broke out, very clearly had to basically defend a number of options. Think about the Crimean Chars. Think about Ukraine itself. Think about Russia. Now, what kind of role would Turkey want to play in a new world order? Only siding with one nation, with one group? No, of course not. If you really want to become a global player, and this is what Turkey has almost achieved, is you have to talk, you have to listen, and then you have to give advice. And the advice is not necessarily based on weapons, but on diplomacy. I'm not only talking about the grain diplomacy between Moscow and Kiev. In general terms, Turkey has become such a reputable, trusted negotiator and mediator, and let's hope that this conflict will be over soon. The numbers of young and innocent people on both sides and families having lost their family members, it is still shocking.
Now you've given us a sense of what's in it for the EU here. What about Turkey? What are they hoping to gain from this partnership?
Sorry, I haven't heard the last word.
What are Turkey hoping to achieve from these conversations with the EU?
Well, to be honest, finally, and again, I'm very frank about this and very brief, promised, I want to see visa liberalization for bona fide tourists and businessmen into the EU, and this not promised and then again put on ice for the next 20 years. I want to see an updating of the customs union, again, not in the next 20 years, but hopefully by 2026 or 2027. I don't want to see any more patting on the shoulder. Thank you for taking all the migrants. We give you money, but we don't really help you in taking care of it. So these are my key points: migration, customs union, and visa liberalization. And if the EU has any serious interest in ever letting Turkey join the EU, these are the issues which could be ticked off, not overnight, but let's say 1 year from now, overnight, when hopefully we meet again on the same program in 2027 and we convey the good news to our listeners.
Certainly one to watch, isn't it? We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us and for providing your insights.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That's your news for this hour. Stay tuned to A News for more updates, and thank you for watching.